Hi, good evening. I'm going to review a little bit more with you for the midterm exam. Some people in class did the practice exam, and I'm going to go over the questions that most people got wrong, and so I'll assume that those are the kinds of things you might need a little bit of help with. So in terms of the film so in the class that met in person and that I recommended that you rent, there are going to be, let's say, 2 questions from that. So, if you haven't seen the film, then I guess, you can read the notes that I wrote, you can find out what you can about reviews and things like that online. But that's going to have about 2 questions. So there was a question on the practice exam on Parsons and on the article that we read about Parsons, and everyone got that question right, so I'm going to assume that you have a pretty good knowledge of understanding what he was talking about and the systems approach to understanding organizations. So again, review the article, read through the notes that I put up on Blackboard for that one. There was a question on the characteristics of bureaucracy, which didn't seem like too difficult a question, but a lot of people, relatively speaking, let's say out of 20, 6 people got it wrong. So let me go over that question a little bit for you. I'm just taking a look at it now. Okay, so that question asks about the characteristics of bureaucracy, and I think most people know about rules and a kind of rational approach to running organizations. We've talked a lot about that. But some of the less obvious choices people tended to get wrong, like the idea that written records have to be kept, and people in a bureaucracy are promoted based on qualifications, not based on their personalities or other factors. And individuals do in the past, for example, you might have, because you came from a certain family, you might have went into a position. So you have to understand that in a bureaucracy, it's based on some kind of measurable, quantifiable criteria. Again, the diploma, years of service. So understand about that. Understand all the things that are required, the features that are common to bureaucracies in the ideal situation. Again, we talked about how in every bureaucracy it may deviate somewhat from that. Some questions about Taylor and scientific management that a few people got wrong. You should understand, the whole concept of scientific management. Again, the best way, reviewing your essay, because you wrote the essay, which you explained what the characteristics of scientific management were. Understand that, let me just see what people got wrong on this question, that the scientific approach to work looks at or aims at more efficiency, and also aims at higher levels of production and putting less stress on the worker. But the scientific approach to management is not concerned with human interaction and the happiness and how content the worker is. He or she, Taylor's view on that is pretty much that the management has to create the projects and has to administer the projects, and particularly for the most simple workers like the pig iron handlers, they're not capable of making rational or logical choices. They'll actually wear themselves out if they're not given precise directions. So understand that concept. What about Braverman's critique of scientific management? What are the factors? Think about when you look at that again. What were the issues? What were the main points of his criticism? Did he think that scientific management, Braverman again, coming from the side, looking from the point of view of the workers, does he really think scientific management is scientific? If it was science, that's one of his criticisms. He says if scientific management was scientific, then it would be aimed at finding the truth or finding the best possible way of doing things. But he's saying, no, in fact, it's not scientific, it's not rational, it's based on putting forward the privilege or advantage of management. So it has a bias, and the bias is toward management. So understand that. So he's very critical that, yes, okay, the work that's done is timed and precise and measured and projected, but it's all for the benefit of the company, for the management, and it doesn't consider what's best for workers or what their particular benefit might be in one situation or another. So the next question about his critique, he's also upset and he's also angry about the idea that the task idea, where management again creates a very small subset of a total job and gives the individual one piece of the job, is de-skilling workers. So think about how, if, for example, you're an artist and you would like to paint an entire canvas, a picture, and you have a creative process going on, or a designer, let's say you'd like to make a dress, and you would like to design, sketch the dress, cut out the pattern, sew it, decide on the material. But what if you're working in a kind of company that uses this approach, and instead of being able to do the whole process, whether the artist or the designer, you only get to do a few strokes of paint in one corner of the canvas, and then somebody else comes in and does the other side, and 5 or 6 or 10 people, it's passed down a line, an assembly line kind of process. Then what's happening is you're being de-skilled as an artist or as a designer if all you do is cut one part of the pattern and somebody else gets next to you, continues from there. So you're not able to exercise your full creative capacity. So that was another challenge that he had to scientific management, that it's unfair to the worker and it alienates the worker. And he also felt that it takes away their agency, it takes away their individuality. They're not allowed to do things for themselves. So that's something that he's very critical about. So understand his criticisms. There'll be at least one question, if not two, about him, Braverman. And then the next set of questions is about the human relations management. And again, that fundamental point that you need to understand about the shift, that scientific management is only concerned with efficiency and with productivity, and yes, concerned with workers from the point of view that the worker is needed, is a kind of resource that the company needs to exploit, in this case, from the critical point of view. And then also from the human relations point of view, because the human relations point of view says we need to look at not just the technical conditions, not just at, yes, we want efficiency and we want to move forward, but we also have to provide a certain kind of psychological, a certain kind of social and interactive environment for the employees so that the employee will be motivated and will be encouraged to want to participate. And then you can get so much more work out of a person who's motivated and dedicated. Again, think of religion, think of when a person is in love, when a person has some kind of incentive or motivation other than money. So the scientific management looks at the question of money and looks at how giving an incentive of some more money will be enough to motivate the employee, or providing the right tools and technical kinds of situations that are managed by managers and coordinators will be enough, or will be sufficient to increase productivity. But now again, the human relations approach looks at the psychological factors and the impact that they have. And so in the studies that you look at, even when you change the technical conditions, in one of the cases you have the illumination situation, you almost put the lights out completely, you make them higher, you make them less bright. No matter what happened, because the women were being treated in a different way and felt special or felt cared for, they still performed at a high level, at a higher level than before the experiment took place. So that's something to understand. And in the bank wiring room, the bank wiring observation room, where we're looking at men, and the women, it was the relay assembly testing room. The men behaved differently, and the men were observed. They were taken from different parts of the company. They were observed, but they were given an incentive that if they worked faster or they worked better, that they would be given some extra money. And so what happened in this case, the men, although they were taken, as I mentioned, from different departments and didn't really have a strong work culture, they did have, they didn't have with each other. They probably did in their respective departments. And they were very suspicious of management. They didn't want to work too fast. They were afraid that if they worked at the rate that management would like them to work at, then what would happen is they would perhaps, require more from them, and their comfort level would have been challenged. So the men were very suspicious of management. They were not willing to make the kinds of adjustments that the women were making, and probably the reason, we don't know exactly, but probably the reason is that the men had more of a sense that this was their career, that they were going to stay in this position maybe for the rest of their lives, and they were very protective, very distrustful of the interests of management. And maybe rightly so, because in some cases that very thing happens in some kinds of factories or industrial plants. And maybe the women could have possibly believed that, maybe when they were going to marry, have children, they wouldn't work anymore. This was a temporary part of their life, possibly. So it could have been that they were much more susceptible to the management, to the, to the intervention that the management had than the men did, because the men kind of were from, again, this more developed work culture and identification as being working class men who had to protect their interests. Okay, so you have a few questions. I'm skipping over things that everybody got right or that no one had problems with. You have a couple of questions on the tech firm, on the high-tech firm that we read, the article that we read. So again, the best preparation, reading it and understanding. There's going to be a question about the leader of the high-tech firm. What kind of commitment did he expect from workers? So is he a charismatic leader? Is he a traditional leader? Think about, again, Max Weber talks about bureaucracy and how you have a legal, rational kind of authority in a bureaucratic organization. Like think about United Nations or, at Brooklyn College, right? You need to have in the registrar's office, you need to have accountability, you need to have people who have credentials, who everyone reports to somebody else, checks and balances in those kinds of organizations. Now, when we're talking about high technology companies, are there the same needs? Or when you're dealing with creativity, when you're dealing with an industry that is based on innovation and change and development, you probably need a leader who's much more inspiring, somebody who is going to get like a total level of commitment and dedication out of employees because he's inspiring them. Think about also in this company, in the high-tech corporation, the people that are working there are primarily engineers, and then there are some support staff, HR people and accountants. But the stars, the big important people in the company are the engineers, just like it might be the case at a lot of technology firms today. And so they have a professional identification, the fact that they're working in this industry, and they have computer science backgrounds, and they have a certain kind of character that, and identification with the kind of work that they do. So he creates a culture where people are totally committed, but also creates a culture where it's because people want to be. People identify with the larger mission of the organization, which is connected to their self-identity as well. So we can kind of see that if you're working in a very bureaucratic situation, again, let's imagine maybe in the registrar's office, it might not be the most exciting, it might not be the most inspiring kind of work, but if you're working in a technology firm where there's lots of change and people are kind of excited about new directions that technology can go in, and you feel like you're an architect of that kind of change system, can be very exciting. It can be something that you can want to devote yourself to fully. So what he does is he uses the leader of the company, gets a commitment at the very personal level so that the person's identity becomes connected to the company and connected to the work. And so they're willing to work long hours, and it doesn't feel like they're being in any way manipulated. It doesn't feel like the men who were afraid that management was going to try to take too much of their time or take too much of their work product. It's a different kind of feeling because they're doing something that is a different, it's an industrial product. But when you're an engineer, when you're a fashion designer, when you're somebody in a more creative capacity, part of that satisfaction that comes out of your work is to see that and to feel like you're involved in the whole process or involved in some important part of something that you can see in its totality. So it's very different from the work that, is done in factories. So try to think about when you read that article how people in those fields would feel differently, how a different kind of management would be called for. So I think that's why I wanted to include that article, because it's such a contrast to some of the other companies we've been looking at. And then in the future, we're going to look at corporate management. We're going to look at different kinds of companies that contemporary kinds of work situations. And we're going to think about how management changes, how the functions, how the structure, how cultures of organizations change as a result of the kinds of products that are being produced, the kinds of goals that these organizations have. So try to think of it as a cohesive picture, that we went from, we're chronologically, we're moving forward in the future, but we're also looking at different kinds, from manual labor to intellectual to labor that has to do with creativity and innovation and intellectual thought, which, again, when we saw that film, if we saw it with Frank's father, that was not part of his world, but it is part of the engineer's world. It is part of the world of people who work in investment banking, people who are doing things that have important consequences in the economy, in people's lives, in technology, and in society in general. So good luck on the exam, and if you have any individual questions, you can always send me an email. I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.